They say America creates legends, but every now and then someone comes along who isn't just a legend, he's a force of nature. Someone who makes the world stop, breathe, and say, "Hold up, who is this man?" Now, picture this. It's a cold afternoon in the late 1950s. The crowd is rumbling, restless, waiting for something, anything, to jolt them awake. And then he steps onto the field. Broad shoulders, stone-cold eyes, a presence so heavy it feels like gravity bends around him. Before the game even starts, the other team knows they're in trouble. Because the man standing across from them isn't just an athlete, he's a storm. That storm was named Jim Brown. To many, he's the greatest football player who ever lived. To others, he's a civil rights force, a Hollywood star, a businessman, an activist, a disruptor, and a man who refused to let the world define him. But behind the fame, behind the highlight reels, behind the polished interviews and magazine covers, there's a story America never fully understood. A story of discipline that bordered on obsession. A story of mental conditioning decades ahead of its time. A story of controversy, of power, of flaws, and of a vision for Black America that scared the people who wanted him to stay in line. This is the real life of Jim Brown, the untold habits, the unheard conversations, the battles he fought in private, the choices that made him a target, and the legacy he engineered with precision. This is not just a story about a football player. This is the story of a man built like a monument and wired like a revolutionary. A man who walked through America like he wasn't part of it, because he was trying to build something beyond it. And before we get deep into this journey, if you're watching this because you love real athlete stories, the raw ones, the honest ones, the ones the world hides, then hey, you're in the right place. Go ahead and join the Athletes Book family, where we tell the stories behind the legends, because some lives are too powerful to be forgotten. Now, let's step into the world of Jim Brown. He was born on February 17th, 1936, on St. Simon's Island, Georgia. A place of beauty, yes, but also a place where the scars of American history weren't just memories. They were alive in the soil. Jim came into a world shaped by segregation, by inequality, by the kind of quiet pain that people learned to live with because nobody gave them another choice. His mother, Teresa, worked as a domestic worker. His father was mostly absent. And like so many Black families of the time, survival wasn't a lifestyle, it was a profession. But there was something different about the boy. Even as a child, Jim carried himself like he knew something the world didn't. He wasn't loud, he wasn't reckless, he was focused. People who knew him as a kid said he had that old soul energy, the kind that makes adults stop mid-conversation just to study him. He moved with purpose, like he understood the world was trying to box him in and he was already planning his escape. And that escape? It started with sports. At Manhasset High School in New York, where he moved at age 8, Jim Brown didn't just play sports, he dominated them. Football, basketball, baseball, lacrosse, track, whatever field you put him on, the scoreboard tilted in his direction. Coaches couldn't wrap their heads around him. Other athletes couldn't imitate him. Reporters didn't even have the vocabulary for him. It wasn't just a talent. Thousands of kids have talent. Jim had something colder. He had intention. Behind the scenes, Jim was building himself like a machine. He woke up early, trained alone, ran until his legs shook, then ran some more. He wasn't doing it because he loved practice. He was doing it because he was designing an identity. Jim Brown wasn't trying to be the best on the field. He was trying to be untouchable in life. People talk a lot about his football skills, but they rarely talk about the mental blueprint behind them. Jim practiced visualization before it became trendy. He saw the field in his mind before he touched it. He studied angles. He studied leverage. He studied fear, not his, but other people's. Jim Brown realized early that football wasn't a game of violence. It was a game of emotional control. If he could break your mind, he didn't need to break your body. His high school success earned him a ticket to Syracuse University, where his legend grew teeth. At Syracuse, Brown wasn't just doing well, he was rewriting the book. He excelled in every sport, but the field where he left his deepest footprint was football. Even still, he wasn't treated as an equal. Let's keep it real. America in the 1950s wasn't built to celebrate a young black man with this level of dominance. He faced racism from students, from fans, from systems that wanted him grateful, not great. But Jim had no interest in being grateful. His teammates remembered something about him that stuck for decades. Jim Brown didn't talk trash, not because he was polite, but because he didn't need to. His silence had weight. His stare had language. When he ran the ball, he didn't celebrate, didn't bark, didn't chest bump. He just got up, dusted himself off, and walked back like he was already thinking about the next play. And that bothered people because the message was clear: you can't move me. This psychological dominance would later become one of his most famous and feared habits. Jim Brown studied the art of not reacting. He understood that when you refuse to respond, you become unpredictable, and unpredictable men are dangerous, especially to systems that rely on control. In 1957, the Cleveland Browns drafted him. They didn't know it yet, but they had just brought in the most unstoppable force the NFL had ever seen. His rookie season wasn't just good, it was historic. Rookie of the Year, league rushing leader, MVP discussions on day one. And as the years went on, it got worse for anyone trying to defend him. Jim Brown wasn't built like a running back from the 1950s. He belonged in some future generation of athletes who looked engineered, not born. He ran with a style that defied physics. Straight-line speed like a sprinter, mass like a linebacker, balance like a gymnast. And the most terrifying part? Jim Brown didn't run away from tackles. He ran through them. Opponents said tackling him felt like hitting a moving oak tree. His stiff arm was a weapon. His footwork was poetry disguised as punishment. But the numbers only tell half the story. The secret to Jim Brown's dominance, the part most fans never saw, was his private regimen. Teammates said his discipline was almost scary. Jim trained in silence. No music, no hype, no noise. Just breath and repetition. He studied running angles like chess openings. He practiced controlling his pulse during stress, lowering his heart rate at will. This mental stillness translated to the field. When chaos exploded around him, he moved like the only calm man in the storm. And then there was his most legendary habit, the one that left opponents frustrated for a decade. Every time Jim Brown got tackled, he stayed on the ground a few seconds longer than expected. He got up slow, walked slow back to the huddle, limbs loose, body heavy, expression unreadable. People thought he was hurt. Every time. But he wasn't. It was psychological warfare. Move slowly, look tired, make them think you're fading, then explode like dynamite on the next play. Defenders fell for it every single time. Hollywood couldn't have scripted it better. During his 9-year NFL career, Jim Brown never missed a game. He retired with almost every rushing record the league had. He was the most reliable, most durable, most dominant player on the field. But while he was rewriting the NFL's record books, he was also rewriting his own life story, one that would lead him into Hollywood, politics, civil rights movements, business ventures, and controversy. Because even at the peak of his football glory, Jim Brown was already thinking about what came next. He wasn't trying to be a sports hero. He was trying to be a power figure. He understood something many athletes still struggle with. Fame is temporary, but leverage lasts. Jim Brown wanted leverage, and he knew exactly how to build it. He started meeting with actors, directors, business people, the kind of names that didn't just rise in American culture, they shaped it. Jim Brown was studying influence like he once studied running lanes. He knew America respected two things: power and independence. So he made sure he had both. But underneath the empire he was quietly building, tension was rising. The civil rights movement was growing louder, hotter, more dangerous. And Jim Brown wasn't the kind of man who could watch from the sidelines. Still, his approach was never soft, never mainstream. He didn't march like Dr. King. He didn't embrace nonviolence the way many activists did. He had his own philosophy, rooted in self-discipline and personal responsibility, a mindset some admired and others criticized. But before activism would take center stage in his life, Hollywood came calling. And in 1964, while still at the peak of his NFL career, Jim Brown appeared in the movie Rio Conchos. That changed everything. He realized he could make more money, more moves, and more waves outside the NFL than inside it. So in 1966, at just 30 years old, Jim Brown did something unthinkable, something that shook American sports to its core. He retired at his peak as the best football player alive, without injury, without decline. Why? Because someone told him what he couldn't do, and Jim Brown never tolerated that.
Jim Brown never reacted well to authority trying to control him, especially not when it came to his future. During filming for The Dirty Dozen, production schedules clashed with Brown's training camp dates. Brown's coach wanted him back immediately. The studio wanted him on set. And Jim? He wasn't about to let anybody dictate the terms of his life. The Cleveland Browns front office thought they could push him. They thought they could threaten fines. They thought they had leverage over him. What they didn't understand was that Jim Brown had already decided the NFL wasn't going to own him forever. So instead of bowing, he dropped a bomb on the sports world. He retired in the middle of filming, turned around, and walked into Hollywood like he'd been preparing for it all his life. America was stunned. Fans couldn't believe it. Reporters scrambled for answers. But deep down, Jim knew exactly what he was doing. He was shifting from a world where he was controlled to a world he planned to control. His old teammates said that even after leaving the league, Jim walked around with the same intentional presence he had on the field. Calm, heavy, steady, like a man who had already measured every move 10 steps ahead. Hollywood gave him the platform he wanted, but it also came with a different kind of pressure. A black man leading major films in the late 1960s? That wasn't normal. It was a statement. Jim wasn't just breaking into movies. He was walking through doors America didn't think he had the right to open. And Jim Brown never walked softly through any door. He made sure people noticed. His film career exploded with roles that didn't play into stereotypes. He wasn't playing servants or one-dimensional side characters. He positioned himself as a leading man, strong, sharp, fearless. And to be honest, a lot of people weren't ready for that. Hollywood didn't know what to do with a black actor who carried himself like a king on screen and off. He wasn't just acting, he was demanding new rules. That's something about Jim people rarely understood. Every move he made was strategic. When he entered Hollywood, he didn't see it as an artistic dream. He saw it as a power play. He used his fame to influence studios, to open opportunities for other black actors, to push for more creative control. And he started speaking publicly about building economic strength in black communities, real wealth, real ownership. not just symbolic victories. Behind closed doors, Jim Brown was having conversations most athletes at the time didn't even know were possible. Meetings with politicians, activists, financiers, discussions about ownership, investment, business infrastructure. Jim wasn't trying to be a celebrity. He was trying to become a blueprint. But Jim was also complicated, intensely so. For everything he built publicly, there were storms privately. His personal life was loud, messy, unpredictable. There were multiple accusations of violence against women, police incidents, moments where his temper and authority clashed with the environment around him. These controversies followed him for decades, and Jim Brown never fully escaped them. But his supporters argued that the same fire that made him unstoppable also made him dangerous when it wasn't controlled.
Still, one thing is clear. Jim Brown did not hide from conflict. He didn't run. He confronted every accusation, every headline, every public battle with the same stone-faced intensity he used to stare down linebackers. Some felt he used his influence to protect himself. Others said he used it to stay in the fight. But either way, controversy became part of the myth and the man. As Hollywood expanded its platform, Jim's voice in American culture grew sharper. He began forming alliances with some of the most powerful black figures of the era. And then, in 1967, something happened that would become one of the most iconic moments of his life. A meeting that still gets talked about in history books and documentaries. A moment that placed Jim Brown at the heart of black activism. It was called the Cleveland Summit. Picture this, a room filled with some of the biggest names in Black America, Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, then still Lew Alcindor, and surrounded by a group of leaders from sports, business, and activism. The world outside was on fire. Athletes were being pressured to stay silent, to stay in line, to stick to sports. But inside that room, inside that meeting, a new form of power was being born. The summit was organized to support Ali's refusal to be drafted into the Vietnam War. But more than that, it was a display of unity among black athletes, something America had rarely seen. And Jim Brown was at the center of it, not as a follower, not as a participant, but as an architect. He helped bring those men together. He pushed for economic independence. He wanted black athletes to realize they had leverage, real leverage, and should use it to uplift their people, not just entertain America. People who were there say Jim carried himself like he was leading a board meeting, not a protest. Calm, measured, direct. He didn't yell, he didn't grandstand. He laid out the strategy like an executive explaining a new business plan. That was the thing about Jim that set him apart from other public figures of the time. He wasn't trying to inspire emotions. He was trying to inspire results. And that same mindset led him to one of the most important projects of his life, the American Foundation. Launched in 1988, American was Jim Brown's attempt to do something that marches, speeches, and slogans alone could not. He wanted to reform people from the inside out, especially young men in gangs or on the edge of violence. This wasn't a PR move. Jim went into prisons, into neighborhoods most politicians wouldn't even drive through. He sat face to face with gang members, with people who lived by codes of survival. And they listened to him, not because he was famous, but because he radiated authority they understood. Jim Brown didn't talk down to them. He didn't sugarcoat anything. He challenged them, told them the world wasn't going to save them. They had to save themselves. And the message hit because it was coming from someone who lived his entire life refusing to be defined by anyone else's limits. But while he was pouring his energy into activism, he was also navigating battles of his own. The media never fully let go of the allegations that shadowed him. Critics accused him of using activism as a shield. Supporters argued he was being targeted.
The truth is complex. Like Jim himself, a man capable of deep, relentless discipline and equally capable of harsh, explosive conflict. A man trying to uplift others while struggling with parts of his own nature. Jim Brown's story isn't clean, it isn't simple, it isn't polished, and that is exactly why it matters. Because legends aren't made from perfect lives, they're made from powerful ones. In the later stages of his life, Jim Brown continued to act, produce, mentor, and push conversations about race, masculinity, and community forward. He stayed influential, not because he chased attention, but because he understood influence comes from presence. And Jim Brown had presence until his final days. That heavy, calm, calculated presence that made entire rooms adjust themselves around him. Even in old age, when his steps slowed and his playing days were long gone, Jim still spoke with the unshakable confidence of a man who had played his life like a strategy game. He criticized politicians, he challenged activists, he disagreed publicly with leaders he once stood beside. And whether people loved him or hated him, they always listened. Because whether the world agreed with him or not, they knew Jim Brown wasn't pretending. He spoke what he believed, he lived what he preached, and he carried himself with the same emotional armor he built as a kid on St. Simon's Island. Jim Brown once said that greatness isn't about talent, it's about ownership. Ownership of your mind, your choices, your discipline, your identity. And that was his blueprint for future generations. A message for young athletes, young black men, young leaders trying to find their place in a world that still wants to box them in. Jim's message was simple but heavy. Stand your ground, build your power, and never let anyone write your story for you. Jim Brown passed away in 2023 at the age of 87. And when the news broke, it wasn't just the sports world that felt the loss. It was Hollywood. It was the civil rights community. It was the men he mentored in prisons and neighborhoods. It was the players who study his tape like scripture. It was the people who never met him but saw in him a kind of strength America doesn't produce often. Jim Brown's legacy is complicated, controversial, powerful, and unforgettable. He was greatness and grit, discipline and defiance, beauty and brutality. A man who walked like he knew exactly who he was in a world that constantly tried to tell him otherwise. And that is why, decades from now, when people talk about the greatest athletes of all time, when they talk about the most influential black leaders, when they talk about the men who shaped their era instead of being shaped by it, Jim Brown's name will still echo. Because legends fade, but forces of nature, they never disappear. Jim Brown's transition into activism didn't come with applause. It came with heat, pressure, expectations. America had a way of loving its black heroes on the field while fearing them once they stepped off it. And Jim never forgot that. He once said that America wanted him to run, not speak. And that mindset shaped the next phase of his life. He knew exactly what he represented: a physically dominant, intellectually sharp, economically ambitious black man in a time when that combination made people nervous. Jim didn't shrink from that role. He leaned into it. But what people didn't see were the countless behind-the-scenes battles Jim fought, not just against systems, but within himself. There was this myth that great athletes glide through life with confidence like it's something wired into their DNA. But Jim wasn't superhuman emotionally. He had doubts, frustrations, moments where anger simmered so close to the surface that even people close to him backed up. And it was in these moments where Jim's most personal discipline emerged. Jim had a private habit, something only close friends knew. When something frustrated him, he didn't lash out immediately. He withdrew, sat alone, thought deeply. He would replay the situation in his mind like game film. Slow, analytical, dispassionate. He once told a friend that if he lost control of his emotions, he lost control of his identity. That alone made him dangerous in conflict, but powerful in strategy. Even when people accused him of things, even when tabloids screamed his name, even when a whole system seemed like it wanted to bring him down, Jim's instinct was always to hold himself still. He learned that stillness gave him the advantage. He wasn't running from the world, he was studying it. That's a trait most people never understood. Jim Brown had this unique ability to see 10 layers beneath the surface of a situation. A journalist once described speaking to Jim Brown as being interviewed by him because he would turn every conversation back on the other person, studying them, dissecting their intentions. Some found it intimidating, others found it brilliant, but nobody ever called it accidental. This habit of observation shaped his activism. Jim wasn't a protest leader in the traditional sense. He wasn't about chants, signs, or speeches that made people feel good but changed nothing. He wanted results. He wanted efficiency. He wanted transformation. And he believed that transformation started inside the individual, not inside Congress.
That's why the America I Can program became his heart project. Not the movies, not the awards, not the money, but the work he did in prisons and inner-city neighborhoods. The hours spent behind locked doors, sitting across from men the world had thrown away. Men who had never had a father figure. Men who had never been told they were worth something. Men whose lives were shaped by trauma, anger, and survival instead of opportunity. Jim Brown walked into those rooms without fear. Even guards were nervous. But Jim? He walked in casually, hands in his pockets, gaze steady like he was walking into a locker room before a big game. And something interesting happened. The toughest men, the ones other inmates stayed away from, softened around him. Not because Jim demanded respect, but because he carried himself like someone who had nothing to prove. His method was simple, but brutally effective. No excuses, no emotional shortcuts, no blaming the world. Jim made people confront themselves, their choices, their patterns, their habits. He made them take accountability for the parts of their lives that nobody else could fix. And for many of those men, it was the first time anyone had ever challenged them that way without judgment attached. Jim believed deeply in the power of mental discipline. To him, physical strength was nothing compared to psychological strength. He taught people how to control impulses, how to respond instead of react, how to plan instead of hope, how to rebuild instead of collapse. And many of those men credit him for changing their lives in ways courts, schools, and social systems never did. But activism didn't erase the controversies that followed Jim throughout his adulthood. His personal relationships were turbulent. Accusations of violence resurfaced multiple times. His temper was unpredictable, and media outlets, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, covered those incidents relentlessly. Critics called him a hypocrite. Supporters called him misunderstood. The truth, like most truths, lived somewhere in the tension between the two. Jim Brown was flawed, unquestionably. But he was also transparent about those flaws. He wasn't interested in being seen as a saint. He was interested in being effective. And effectiveness in his eyes meant engaging with communities society had written off. It meant diving into issues other celebrities avoided because they were too messy, too uncomfortable, too dangerous to their public image. Jim never cared about image. What he cared about was impact. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, younger athletes would seek him out for advice. Some expected the warm mentor persona Hollywood sometimes portrayed. What they got instead was a man who spoke to them like equals. Direct, no sugarcoating, no hand-holding. If a player complained about their coach or their contract, Jim would cut them off with a stare that felt like a diagnostic exam. "Are you building something?" he would ask. "Or are you waiting for something?" He pushed athletes to become businessmen, not just performers, to master financial literacy, to invest, to think beyond fame.
He taught them that even the most celebrated career was temporary, but the mind, the disciplined mind, was permanent. He didn't want young athletes to repeat his mistakes. He wanted them to surpass him. And yet, in his own quiet moments, Jim carried memories and wounds that never fully healed. Growing up in the segregated South, watching his mother work exhausting hours, living with the knowledge that no matter how successful he became, there were still people who would see him as less. Those experiences built him, but they also hardened him. Jim once admitted privately that a part of him was always on guard, always ready for a fight. That emotional armor helped him excel in sports and activism, but it made intimate relationships difficult. People around him often felt they were dealing with two versions of Jim: the wise, strategic mentor, and the man who kept his deepest feelings locked behind walls only he knew how to control. But aging has a way of softening even the strongest edges. In his later years, Jim slowed down, not mentally, but physically. His voice became deeper, calmer, his movements more measured. Yet the presence was still there, that same gravitational pull, that same silent authority. Even at 70, even at 80, when people walked into a room with Jim Brown, they felt like they were in the presence of someone who shaped the world, not just lived in it.
He continued meeting with young men in neighborhoods, sitting with community leaders, offering guidance to athletes navigating fame and pressure. He valued private conversations more than public appearances. He understood legacy wasn't built on awards. It was built on influence, on the seeds you planted in the minds of others. And privately, Jim allowed himself to reflect on the journey. The boy from St. Simon's Island who became a high school phenomenon. The college athlete who refused to be defined by racist systems. The NFL star who terrified defenses and walked away at the peak of his power. The Hollywood actor who broke barriers. The activist who stepped into the fire instead of watching from a safe distance. The mentor who changed lives in silence. The man who carried contradictions with the same force he carried footballs. Jim knew his story wasn't neatly packaged, but he believed that real greatness never is. He believed future generations should understand that life isn't about being perfect. It's about being intentional, purposeful, self-directed. He wanted young people to know that no matter where they came from, no matter what the world expected of them, they had the right and the responsibility to define themselves. When Jim Brown passed away in May 2023, tributes came from everywhere. Athletes, activists, politicians, filmmakers, former inmates who credited him with changing their lives. People from every corner of society paused to honor a man whose impact stretched far beyond football. And yet, if Jim were alive to hear those tributes, he probably would have brushed them off. Not because he didn't care, but because he always believed legacies should live in action, not celebration. He once said the measure of a man wasn't how he was remembered, but how deeply he challenged the world around him. Jim Brown challenged America, on the field, on screen, in communities, and in conversations people were afraid to have. His strength wasn't just physical, it was psychological, emotional, ideological. He lived life like a chess game, calculated, strategic, unapologetic. And even now, long after his final breath, his presence hasn't faded. Because some people leave memories, but men like Jim Brown, they leave momentum. Jim Brown's life is a blueprint for understanding power beyond sport. Most people see athletes as performers, people who entertain for a paycheck. Jim saw himself differently. From the beginning, he treated his body, mind, and reputation as assets, tools for leverage, influence, and transformation. Every run he made on the field, every film he starred in, every initiative he led in communities had purpose. Nothing was accidental, nothing wasted. And that's a lesson he made clear to anyone willing to listen.
He carried that same philosophy into activism. When others sought recognition, Jim sought impact. When critics tried to paint him as controversial, he focused on outcomes. He refused to compromise his beliefs for popularity or approval, and that stubbornness, that insistence on owning his path, is part of what makes his story so compelling. It's why, decades after his retirement, he remains a symbol of disciplined defiance, strategic thinking, and uncompromising vision. People often ask what drove him, how someone could dominate football, act in films, navigate controversies, mentor, and lead community initiatives simultaneously. The answer lies in a blend of discipline, focus, and an almost ritualistic approach to self-improvement. Jim practiced mental exercises daily: visualization, breathing control, situational rehearsals. He prepared for life like he prepared for a championship game. He trained his mind to anticipate conflict, to calculate responses, to maintain authority in every scenario. That preparation wasn't flashy. It didn't make headlines, but it gave him control. It gave him power. And in the life of Jim Brown, power was the ultimate currency. His private habits reinforced this control. Jim rose early, spent hours reflecting, journaling, and analyzing challenges. He treated reading and research as forms of strength training. Movies, news articles, biographies, they weren't entertainment. They were study material. Jim understood that knowledge was leverage, and leverage meant freedom. He combined that mental regimen with his physical training, creating a synergy few athletes had ever cultivated. To watch Jim Brown in practice was to witness a man who treated the ordinary like extraordinary, the mundane like a battlefield. But the story of Jim Brown isn't only about control and discipline. It's about courage. Courage to face a world that often wanted him diminished. Courage to step into Hollywood on his terms. Courage to confront racial injustices, sometimes alone, sometimes with allies. Courage to challenge both his critics and his own limitations. Every act of bravery, every defiance of expectation, every calculated risk he took reinforced his reputation as a man who would not be contained. Even his critics admitted it. There was something magnetic, even intimidating, about the way he carried himself. That magnetism made him a leader, a mentor, a trailblazer. It also made him a target. Controversies were an inevitable part of his life. Accusations, misunderstandings, and conflicts followed him from the NFL to Hollywood to his activism. Many would have crumbled under that pressure, but not Jim. He had a philosophy that guided him through these storms. Control what you can, endure what you cannot, and never let anyone define your value. He learned early that public perception is rarely fair. He also learned that influence isn't about being liked, it's about being understood and, most importantly, respected. And so he focused on the work, mentoring youth, producing films, creating programs that changed lives, and building a legacy that no headline could erase. His influence in civil rights and social empowerment is often understated. He was not the type to march in the front lines with megaphones. Instead, he used presence, leverage, and strategy. The Cleveland Summit is a perfect example. Bringing together Muhammad Ali, Bill Russell, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and other prominent figures wasn't just a show of solidarity. It was a calculated act of influence. Jim understood that when Black athletes and leaders stood together, they could command attention and respect that was otherwise denied. That meeting became a blueprint for athlete activism, decades before modern sports figures began to understand their platform as power. And yet, Jim's life was never about heroism in the traditional sense. He knew greatness wasn't about awards, applause, or public validation. It was about impact, quiet, consistent, and far-reaching. He sought to create systems that would endure long after he was gone. The American Foundation exemplified that. By focusing on inner transformation, teaching personal responsibility, and empowering marginalized communities,
Jim ensured his influence extended beyond the stadium, beyond Hollywood, beyond the headlines. He wanted lives changed, not just celebrated. He was also a man of paradoxes. Despite his fame, he maintained an intensely private life. Despite his dominance, he valued stillness. Despite his power, he sought to uplift others rather than merely exert control. Understanding Jim Brown requires embracing these contradictions. His life was not a straight line. It was jagged, complicated, and sometimes uncomfortable, but that complexity made him human, relatable, and ultimately instructive. Even his personal flaws offer lessons. The controversies, the temper, the conflicts, these were not moments to excuse, but moments to study. Jim never hid them. He faced scrutiny with the same honesty he applied to his own self-discipline. And by confronting them, he modeled a form of leadership grounded in accountability, resilience, and the refusal to be broken by circumstance. Jim's vision for future generations was also clear. He didn't want young athletes to merely mimic him. He wanted them to think critically, act deliberately, and control their own narratives. He wanted young black men to understand that they could command power, build wealth, and shape communities without sacrificing integrity or autonomy. And he wanted society to witness that disciplined, strategic, self-directed individuals could not be ignored, contained, or dismissed. As he aged, Jim Brown remained engaged. He continued to mentor, advise, and challenge the world around him. His physical presence may have slowed, but his intellectual and emotional force never diminished. People sought him out not just for guidance, but to witness the energy of a man who had lived fully, unapologetically, and intentionally. And in those private moments, those candid conversations, the real lessons of Jim Brown emerged. The importance of self-mastery, the necessity of preparation, the courage to confront adversity, and the responsibility to lift others while advancing oneself. By the time of his passing in 2023, Jim Brown's impact had permeated multiple spheres: sports, entertainment, civil rights, mentorship, and beyond. But even in his absence, the ripples of his life continue. The athletes who study his techniques, the activists who build on his initiatives, the communities touched by his foundation, they are all living testaments to a man who understood the balance between influence and action, power and purpose. Jim Brown's story is not just one of personal achievement. It is a narrative about the potential of human discipline, vision, and courage. It is about how one individual, refusing to accept imposed limitations, can redefine expectations, challenge systems, and leave a legacy that stretches far beyond personal accolades. His life teaches that greatness is multifaceted: physical, mental, social, and moral. It reminds us that impact matters more than approval, and intentionality more than luck. His journey from a segregated southern town to the pinnacle of sport, film, and activism is a testament to the human capacity for resilience, strategy, and vision. His ability to navigate fame, controversy, and responsibility demonstrates the complexity of leadership under pressure. And his insistence on using power to uplift, guide, and transform reflects a depth of purpose that transcends the ordinary narratives of celebrity. Jim Brown remains an archetype of excellence, a study in contradictions, and a blueprint for anyone striving to define themselves beyond the constraints imposed by society. His life is a lesson in mastery, of self, of influence, and of legacy. For those willing to look past the surface, to understand the private rituals, mental exercises, strategic thinking, and courageous choices, Jim Brown's story is not just compelling. It is instructive, inspiring, and unforgettable. He was a man who understood that history remembers the brave, the disciplined, the strategic, and the unwavering. And in that regard, Jim Brown will never be forgotten. Not because he was flawless, not because he was perfect, but because he lived intentionally, fought relentlessly, and used his life to challenge, teach, and elevate. And so when we look back on the arc of his life, the triumphs, the controversies, the innovations, and the mentorship, we see not just an athlete or celebrity, but a force, a man who harnessed every ounce of his mind, body, and will to leave a footprint that time cannot erase. Jim Brown's legacy is not simply measured in yards rushed or films made. It is measured in the lives transformed, the systems challenged, and the example set for generations to come. In the end, that is the story of Jim Brown, the unstoppable force, the disciplined mind, the unapologetic visionary, a man who defied convention, broke barriers, mastered himself, and demanded that the world recognize the power of an individual who refuses to be limited by expectation. His life reminds us all that true greatness is not inherited, it is constructed meticulously, intentionally, and fearlessly. And for that reason, Jim Brown will forever stand as a testament to the extraordinary potential of human will. But the story doesn't end with his passing. Jim Brown's life continues to echo because of the way he structured influence, built legacies, and demanded excellence from himself and others. He showed that greatness isn't just about being celebrated in the moment, it's about creating impact that reverberates long after your name leaves headlines. The young athletes who watch his footage today aren't just learning how to run, tackle, or pivot. They're learning how to think, how to plan, how to build a life where they control the narrative rather than letting it control them. That's the real genius of Jim Brown. He mastered the art of life the way most people only attempt to master sport. Even outside the realm of football, his influence remained palpable. Hollywood actors, directors, and producers looked to him as someone who challenged the rules without waiting for permission. Activists saw him as a model of strategic defiance, someone willing to engage the system on his own terms. And in communities across America, especially those that struggled with violence and poverty, Jim Brown's initiatives continue to shape lives, proof that action is always more powerful than words. He understood that visibility comes with responsibility. Fame is fleeting, but purpose is enduring. He didn't chase popularity. He chased relevance in a deeper sense, the kind that inspires, teaches, and provokes thought. Every decision, every risk, every calculated move in his life reflected that philosophy. Jim Brown taught the world that legacy is not measured by trophies alone, but by the transformation of minds, the creation of opportunities, and the courage to defy a world that often underestimates you. The NFL may have given him a platform, Hollywood a stage, and history books a narrative, but Jim Brown was never just content with recognition. His true satisfaction came from cultivating change, fostering resilience, and teaching future generations to take ownership of their power. That is why his story resonates across decades, across disciplines, and across cultures. He was more than an athlete, more than a celebrity. He was an architect of influence, a man who recognized that excellence in one arena is meaningless unless it can be translated into influence elsewhere. And perhaps what makes Jim Brown's life most compelling is its duality. On one hand, he was the embodiment of physical dominance, the kind of athlete whose name alone could strike fear into opponents. On the other, he was an intellectual and strategic force, someone who used mental discipline to navigate controversy, craft opportunities, and shape movements. These contrasting traits, the muscle and the mind, the temper and the strategy, the public persona and the private discipline,
coexist in a way that elevates him from hero to legend. His approach to leadership was unconventional. Jim never sought validation from institutions or approval from critics. He led by example, using presence, conviction, and strategic action. His silence was as powerful as his words, his stillness as commanding as his motion, and his calculated decisions as impactful as his most famous runs. Every interaction, every initiative, every film and program became a testament to his philosophy. Mastery is intentional, influence is cultivated, and life is to be owned, not borrowed. Looking back, Jim Brown's life is a study in contrasts and convergences. A man shaped by segregation, yet unshackled by it. A man who faced controversy, yet remained revered. A man who dominated physically, yet excelled mentally. A man who embraced risk, yet meticulously planned every move. A man whose mistakes were as instructive as his victories. And perhaps most importantly, a man who understood that power and purpose, when combined, create a legacy that defies time. Jim Brown leaves us with a blueprint, not just for athletes, but for anyone striving for impact. Discipline yourself relentlessly, master your craft, confront life strategically, embrace accountability, and never allow the world to dictate your worth. Those who study him will realize that his genius wasn't confined to the football field or the silver screen. It was a way of life, a philosophy of intentionality that anyone can adopt if they are willing to commit.
As we remember Jim Brown today, we are reminded that true greatness is holistic. It is not just measured in points scored, movies made, or headlines dominated. It is measured in the lives influenced, the boundaries challenged, the legacies forged, and the courage to confront every arena of life with purpose, strategy, and unyielding self-respect. He redefined what it meant to be an athlete, a man, and a leader. And so, when future generations ask, who was Jim Brown? The answer is clear. He was more than the records, more than the accolades, more than the controversies. He was a force that reshaped expectations, a teacher whose lessons echo through decades, a leader who refused to bow to limitation, and a human whose complexity makes his story not just worth telling, but worth living. Jim Brown's life reminds us that the greatest legacy is not the one written in history books, but the one written in action. It is the change you create, the boundaries you push, and the lives you touch. He was a man of vision, discipline, and courage, a man who lived on his own terms and demanded the same from those around him. That is the essence of his greatness. That is the force of his life. That is why Jim Brown will remain unforgettable, not only to fans of football, Hollywood, or civil rights, but to anyone who understands what it truly means to live deliberately, powerfully, and with purpose. His story is complete, but its impact is eternal. And for those who want to walk in his footsteps, Jim Brown offers a simple, uncompromising challenge. Define your life on your own terms. Prepare yourself to the fullest. Confront challenges without fear and use your power not just for yourself, but for the generations that follow. That is the enduring lesson of the greatest athlete and civil rights activist America has ever produced. That is Jim Brown.